Thank you all. Welcome to today's Safe Systems Speaker Series event. This is the third that we've had, the first of this year. It's great seeing so many wonderful people congregating here. I know all of you care deeply about the topic that we have. Road safety is top of mind for a lot of us. It's a major area of concern. And we are really lucky to have an exceptional speaker here today. Before we get started, I did want to acknowledge AAA Washington for the wonderful spread they provided us. Just a round of applause for. And what I'd like to do is, for those of you who don't know me, my name's Franz Lowenhers, Mobility Planning Solutions Manager with the city, and I'm really honored to welcome you all here. Before we get started with Kristen's presentation, I wanted to provide her with a little sense of the audience and who you all are. If I could have a show of hands of those of you who are here for this is your first Safe System Speaker Series event. Wow, okay, so looks like at least 70% of you. This is wonderful. These events are all about kind of learning, sharing, and last year we had some exceptional speakers focused on safe people and safe speeds, and today's really about technology and data and how we can layer digital infrastructure solutions on the physical infrastructure solutions that we're building. And then another show of hands, if you don't mind, who here is not a City of Bellevue staff person? Wow, okay, great. It's wonderful to see representation from City of Bellevue. We have, I know, representatives from transportation, fire, other departments, really reflecting our one city collaboration. This is something that's deeply important to our leadership, our city council, city manager. And a big part of our safe system approach is about learning and sharing with the broader community, making sure that we can be a catalyst for change for the betterment of society. And I know that that's something near and dear to our speaker here today. Kristen White is someone who I've known since 2019. I had the honor of meeting her at MnDOT when she was executive director there, and I've admired her and appreciated her friendship since then as she moved on to ITS America and as the youngest administrator at Federal Highway Administration, and now she's leading Google's transportation work. So it's a real honor to have you here. I'd like to have us all give a welcome round of applause for her. So thank you.
Well, good afternoon. Ooh, okay, I want to try that one more time, only because I am from the Midwest, and the way you greet each other in the Midwest is loud and proud, so good afternoon. There we go. I always like to start conversations with a moment of gratitude. I want to first thank my good friend and one of your community leaders, Franz. I want to thank my colleague who is here, who served with me at the U.S. Department of Transportation, Ms. Victoria. And I also want to thank the parents of one of my amazing mentees, Victoria Christopher from ITS America. I am only here because of people like you all. And I think that's one of the goals I want to talk about today is whether it's technology, Vision Zero, or our goals, we can only do that in community. And what a community to celebrate. So can we celebrate all of you in Bellevue? I was actually supposed to be here for another conference, and when Franz reached out and said, would you? I said, yes. Oh, wait, what is it? Okay. So I want to talk just a little bit today. I'm going to spend about 15 to 20 minutes to talk about some of what I've learned in transportation being in the public and private sector. And then what I'm really excited about is I hope I will whet your appetite just enough for a really robust question answer. And as I like to say, heckle Kristen. So be prepared. I just want to share a little bit. As a woman, a younger woman in this industry, sometimes I do have to share my background to prove that I can talk about some of these topics. It's not ideal, but sometimes as the only in a room, you are required to talk about your background. And so what I am showing on this slide is just that I brought about 2 decades of public sector expertise into the private sector. So I have been in local government at the city of Minneapolis, in one of the coldest regions of America, but another Vision Zero and smart city. I've been at the state of Minnesota, where we founded one of the nation's first innovation programs, where we started to use intelligent transportation systems, so ITS technologies, connected vehicle technologies, autonomous technologies. That's where I got to meet amazing colleagues like at Washington DOT, like Lisa. And in that partnership, we started to grow this national network of expertise, which led me to, as Franz mentioned, help lead a congressionally founded nonprofit called ITS America, which actually helps bridge the gap and divide between the public and private sectors so we can scale innovation together, which is mission driven. And then that led to a wonderful opportunity to serve at the U.S. Department of Transportation under a very mission-driven organization. And that is what led us to this conversation today. So about 3 years ago, in the public sector space, we started to realize that conversations about AI really started to percolate, and people were coming to the forefront of conversation. You were seeing TED Talks, you're seeing YouTube videos, and one of the things that we talked about in our community, in the transportation innovation community, was we cannot continue the same. And so one of the things we talk about at institutions like Google is this Einstein quote, which many of you I'm sure have seen, but for those that are maybe newer to Einstein's quotation here behind me, it's just this idea that we need new tools to solve age-old problems. And we cannot, as his theory of idiocy was, continue to do the same thing and expect different results. And so companies like Google, the tech sector, which is absolutely a pinnacle part of this community here in Washington, realized we need to do things differently, to quote Steve Jobs. And so then we hearken back in all of my conversations and in our work to the mission. So at least for Google's mission, the mission of my organization, about 30 years ago, we were founded as an internet search company. I don't know if any of you remember the original mission, which is just do no evil. We evolved from that to something a little bit more esoteric, to ensuring that one of our goals is to ensure that everyone has all the information they need in one click, the snap of 2 fingers. And that's hard to do in transportation, but I'll share a little bit about how we're going to get there. And all of this work is mission driven. And I always remind us every single day in every single conversation to wake up, or at some point in the day, remember what is your mission and what are your values. And so at Google, this is our mission, right? To organize the world's information and make it accessible and useful. Those are 2 very important words we'll talk about later. But it's not just about the what you're doing, it's about how you're doing it. And what a testament to the community here in Washington and Seattle and Bellevue, because we would be remiss if we accomplished our goals, but we did not lift people up while doing it. And so at Google, and like all of the work you're doing here, we remember that we have to respect everyone in this conversation, including our end users, the people that are traveling on our system, the people that need information, the people that need to understand how to get to the bus on time, otherwise they will lose their job, someone who needs to understand how they're going to safely ride in a bike lane without injury. But we also have to respect this moment in time, the opportunity before us. All of us in this room are privileged to be able to tackle one of the world's largest problems, which is that 1.3 million lives are lost each year across the globe due to road fatalities. That is a number that continues to increase. And in communities unlike Bellevue in Seattle, that number is steadily increasing for people like us who walk and bike to work and where we live. But we also have to respect each other. And this is a climate where it is very important for me to embolden that particular bullet, because we cannot move through tough conversations if we don't empathize with one another. And so that is why 2 years ago, as this AI conversation started to evolve, Google founded what is called Google Public Sector. Now, many of you see Google as a tech behemoth, maybe a competitor with some of your I shall remain unnamed companies here in the Seattle area. But what they wanted to do is say, you know, as the 4th largest company in the world, we have an obligation to do good, and we want to do it a little differently. So they started Google Public Sector to help invest all of their resources and their technical expertise and their ideas into public sector missions. So they started with a couple what we call verticals, I'm learning, in the private sector 6 months in. So they started to use artificial intelligence to, in the healthcare sector, detect cancer earlier in certain types of cancer. They started to use artificial intelligence, learning from lessons from COVID, to help deploy unemployment benefits faster using artificial intelligence. And about a year ago, in early 2023, they came to me and they thought, what about transportation? And I joked with them and I said, well, it's a little late to be talking about transportation. We've been talking about Vision Zero for quite some time. But all jokes aside, we realized Google and the technology sector have a unique opportunity to partner with the public sector and empower these missions. So 2 years ago, Google Public Sector, or what we sometimes call Google for Government, launched. And this year we are launching Google for Transportation. And this image is just to show that in any company like mine, Google, you're going to see we are trying to use all of the vast resources of that corporate network to do good. So while I sit in one part of Google, what we're essentially saying is that whether you're a fan of Waymo or a detractor of Waymo, whether you've used Google Maps or say, absolutely not, I'm using another product, or where you're looking at things like Apple Pay or Gmail or just the simple search engine, we are taking every single data point, which is over 1 billion users alone just in the search engine, and putting all of that into artificial intelligence tools so that we can solve the world's biggest problems that haven't been solved, like Vision Zero and eliminating road fatalities. So I want to talk a little bit about the how. I talked about some of the value systems for large corporate Google, and we have about 10 different philosophical ideas in how we are thinking about transportation and innovation at a company like ours. And as someone who is, some of my friends in the public sector still like to joke that we're recovering public servants, I think some of these ideas really resonate with me as someone who used to work in the public sector. One is, again, a reminder to always wake up every day asking what your mission is. And I'm curious, and maybe we'll just do a hand poll, or if you're unable, you don't have to raise your hand, but can anyone cite their organizational mission off the top of their head? There's a couple. And this is not to lay any sort of comment or critique, but it's just a reminder that we have an opportunity to remind ourselves what our mission is. And so if you cannot recite your organizational mission, I hope you have your own personal mission that brought you here today to talk about transportation, safety, and innovation. We also have a concept called human-centered design. Now, this is a concept that is very steeped in the technology sector and something that I learned about 10, 11 years ago. And it actually started in my new home. I moved from Washington, D.C. to Silicon Valley near the Stanford campus because in the late 50s, they pioneered this concept called human-centered design. And in your fourth series, Franz and Friends, I hope you will all be able to recite the 5-step process to HCD. But what I love is the first 3 concepts that I'll just whet your appetite with. The first part of human-centered design, or sometimes people use customer-centered design, which is how we build a product or an idea or a project or a program, that first step is empathetic inquiry. Now imagine if we woke up every day not only knowing our mission, but asking ourselves, how do I empathize with the person I'm trying to serve today? What is their lived experience like? What were the transportation problems that were really challenging them? What were the high points in their life? What were their low points? And that's how we solve this work together. The second part of human-centered design is refining the problem statement. And for those of you who either work with Bellevue or in the public sector, I'm curious, and you don't have to raise your hands, but just think to yourself, how many times have you been in a room and maybe 20 minutes in, you're like, I don't even think this is the problem that we came to the table to solve. I think it's a different problem. That's why this work is so important. And the third step in human-centered design, and again, I encourage you to learn all 5 portions of it, the third step is brainstorming the art of the possible. And this is why I actually love being in the private sector now, because we literally have whiteboards, because too often, whether it's budgets or risk or we're just exhausted, we don't actually take time to brainstorm every single possibility out there and then refine what might actually help solve the problem. And then we try and solve it brilliantly. And that's with conversations like this, making sure we have bright minds, new minds, young, wise. I say wise, not old. The Botox belies us, friends. But it takes a community of diverse thought leaders to actually solve these problems together. And one thing that I was talking about with some of us today are these next 2 items, both measuring success and leading with outcomes. So in transportation, and I have a friend in the audience who's an expert at performance measures, we too often talk, and I'll share an example from the Federal Highway Administration, about the data around how many lanes did we pave this year? How many pavement markings, which is, that white or yellow strip, did we lay? How many signs did we install? How many traffic lights did we upgrade? I mean, that's interesting information, but I would argue that is a metric that is not telling us how we're bettering off anyone in our communities. And so I challenge us in community, and I think this is the type of partnership that could solve what are the best metrics for success that will actually show us whether we're achieving Vision Zero. And as I noted in the value statement for Google, I really hope that in those conversations, we lead with dignity, because only in good conversation and thorough debate, and again, debating the idea, not the person, will we actually lead to solutions. And with that, it's a reminder to stay humble. I was having a couple of conversations with folks, and even just in my early morning meeting before I came here, we all have to remember that each of us is an expert in this space and deserves to be contributing, to participate, and to be heard. Each of you have a lived experience. You don't have to be a transportation planner or an engineer or an executive or certain letters behind your name. Because you're here and you're interested, you belong, and you are a part of this conversation, and we need to have more philosophical ideas like that. But it also is a reminder that we have an important problem to solve, and we have to act with urgency. Just in the first few minutes of me talking with you today, we've lost almost one person across America due to road fatalities. I, like you, am not okay with that statistic, and that's not just a statistic, it's a family member and a life lost. But that also means that companies have to be transparent. We have to share information, we have to admit when we make mistakes, and we also have to share all of these things together. And imagine what the impossible could look like, right? I think a lot of times we think we have a vision of what the future may look like, and sometimes we have to be okay just imagining the art of the impossible. And at the U.S. Department of Transportation, we used to say this a lot at the Federal Highway Administration, we didn't have a lot of resources, we had a lot of work, not many staff, so we had to stay scrappy. And my favorite view for all of us, the remainder of our conversation today, is just to have fun. That's why we're here. We can actually achieve a mission and enjoy each other while we're doing that. So I'm going to offer 4 key ideas for us, for conversation, for communities as they're trying to incorporate technology into their work. And of course, it starts with vision. And what a vision you all have, Vision Zero, right? You also need to remain curious, innovate, and become outcomes-based. And I'll talk a little briefly about what I view these concepts are. I am hoping that all of you, whether it's today, in the next month, or in the next quarter, will have a clear understanding of what your mission and vision is, and also share what your transportation story is. I don't know if anyone noticed, but I love, in these early conversations before we started today, I love learning why you're here. Now, I don't know about any of you, but I did not grow up, at 5 years old, say, I want to work for the Federal Highway Administration. No. I have a story, a unique story, just like each of you do. My paternal grandfather, Whizzer White, yes, his name was Whizzer. He actually grew up in Mountain View, California, where I'm now calling home. He was killed in a car crash. I never knew my grandfather, and my father was 20 years old at the time it happened. It led to some really challenging time in my father's life, and that impacted our family dynamics. So there's literally not a day goes by where this work is not a key part of my mission. But I encourage you all to think about why you're here. What is your story? And tell your story. The closest distance between two people is a story, and that's why we're here. And I also remind us when we talk about why transportation, right? We are a sector of many sectors, right? A community, a city council like the one behind me, they're thinking about the education department, the budget for labor and workforce development. They're thinking about other public safety budgets. We have to tell that compelling story about why transportation is so central to everything that we do. But I also encourage you to remain curious. And this is, again, such amazing work you all do in this community. I am hoping that in more public sector conversations, we're making decisions and learning based out of curiosity and not making decisions based out of fear. I have a lot of communities saying, I don't want you to come to my agency and talk about artificial intelligence. It's scary. It has no role in my work. And that's okay. But what I offer is I hope we can have a conversation and learn about this before we make conclusions. Listen and seek to understand. And that's really asking what types and specific pieces of information do you actually want to know? Hopefully, I'm whetting your appetite with a little bit of information here as I close, but I hope you are asking questions about what you'd like to learn in our conversation today. Another thing we talk about is safeguards. Risk is inherent in the work that we do, especially in a field where we're trying to save lives each and every day. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't act. And as a recovering lawyer, I like to say I actually started my field in transportation as a lawyer in transportation agencies. And one of the things I remind other folks that are coming from fear or risk-based approaches is risk can be harnessed, risk can be managed. Risk is not inherently a bad thing, but we need to just have that conversation. Now, one of the things I would offer, and again, I think this is something where you're already ahead of some of the public agencies, but for folks that are advising, consulting, partnering with others, procurement is one of our single greatest opportunities and single greatest barriers. Public agencies were designed to procure through things like requests for proposals, right? We would have a list of requirements. For example, this is how we know we need to build this road to these certain specifications. Okay, go do it, and then tell us how much you're going to charge us. That is not how we do technology. And so I would argue we can use requests for information or innovation to learn about what the private sector can offer, what tools are available, and even do things like open-based procurements to be more agile and nimble. And this is a huge passion project of mine as a former procurement and contracts lawyer. I know we're cool people, we're not that bad, but we have a huge opportunity to help public agencies innovate. And lastly, in those conversations, every conversation should begin with, what is our goal at the end of this project? And how do we measure those goals? What are the metrics we need at the beginning of this project? And for the project managers and PMP folks out there, happy to chat later, what are the actual KPIs we need? And how do we measure if a community is any better off? Big question. We have ideas, I bet. So I want to talk about and debut Google for Transportation because this is incorporating all this philosophy as we debut this portfolio of innovation later this year in August at the ITS World Congress in Atlanta, Georgia. The first and foremost is telling our story. People know about Google. People might know about the city of Bellevue, but do they know the work you're doing? Do they know examples and stories of the projects? Do they know your story as you're sharing information about your project? So one of the things we're going to be doing is really encouraging people to have that conversation. Market your story. Ask people why they're in this space. Why is this work so important to you? That is going to help us remind our community, our elected officials, and our community members why this work is so important. We also need to change the way we talk. Now, this is no disrespect to my colleagues in the civil engineering world or the computer engineering world, but my God, it is really hard to have a plain language conversation when you're talking about technology, right? My parents are 77 and 79, and they still can't understand how to use an iPhone, more or less understand what artificial intelligence is. And they're bright people. So we at Google are trying to incorporate what we call plain language, which is defined as the 7th grade reading level, which is the average reading level in America. And that's very evident when you're doing community-based outreach, right? I'm sure you've been to community meetings for those that have been doing that type of engagement and tried to have a conversation about a public works project, and you see those blank spares, a few of which I'm seeing right now. So I need to either get ready or louder, and you realize you just have to speak differently. And plain language is a huge opportunity to drop the jargon and talk to each other, not through each other. We're also trying to grow our partner network. Companies like Google know we can't go it alone. Cities like Bellevue know they can't go it alone. It takes public-private partnerships. It takes saying, I'm going to share with you some of the innovations we might be able to develop together or offer, and the city or community might say, this is what we need for an outcome, and together you can negotiate how you achieve success together. And of course, we're incorporating human-centered design. Again, I hope you learned those 5 steps. I would happily bring anyone out for a coffee, Starbucks or otherwise, I hear is good here, to next year in our 4th event, if folks can recite those 5 ideas for me. And we need to prioritize use cases, which is where I'm going to finish today. When I started at Google, I was asked to do kind of an assessment of what are the different things that we do related to the transportation sector as far as products, services. We all know about Google Maps. We've heard about Waze. There's Waymo. But that's very public-facing. What else are we doing? And after a couple months, we realized we have over 400 different applications that can support our transportation mission. But boy, that's a lot. That's too many for anyone who is just struggling to do their task list for the day to try and learn. So what we tried to do out of all these different areas that a public works or public safety agency or city transportation department is trying to understand, we tried to prioritize them. And this is where Google is thinking this year, and this is an early preview. And it focuses in 4 key areas: safety, resiliency, or of course sustainability, operations, and planning. And I'm going to give a snippet preview of a few of these applications, but I want to give you an overview before I do that. Often, and I shared this with a few of you, when I talk to stakeholders across the country, I ask, what is one of your most significant concerns in transportation? And they say the word safety. But the word safety is big. So what does that mean? At Google, we are doing things like developing artificial intelligence tools using predictive analytics, AI, and even cameras to, in states like California, ingest all that data, send it to what's called a transportation management center, which you have a great one here at Bellevue, and then redeploy emergency responders 8 to 11 minutes early. And in 2023, when 42,000 people died on America's roads, 42% of those humans were alive in the first few minutes. So a simple artificial intelligence tool that took less than 6 weeks to develop can save thousands of lives nationally. We're also using that in communities in Northern California to detect where vulnerable road users are. And I know that's really important in this community. For those of us who love to walk, bike, roll, stroll, it's really important that vehicles and the systems see us and prevent those crashes. But also the people that we employ are busy on our roads, right? Whether it's Sound Transit expanding, whether it's the city of Bellevue paving bike lanes, we have maintenance and construction and other contractors out on the roads. Those work zones and traffic control areas need to be controlled, and we have new artificial intelligence tools that can detect when vehicles might be entering close to those zones and immediately diverting them. These are important safety measures. But so too is resiliency, especially such a gorgeous community as this part of Washington. It's so beautiful to be here today. And yet, our climate is giving us bigger challenges each week, month, and year. And so Google is partnering with NOAA and our Google Research Program to do things like ingest better weather data through our Google satellites and other third-party data so that we can inform communities up to 5 days in advance when a rain or weather event will be flooding. Now, I'll share a story, because stories are powerful. One of the hardest things I ever had to do as a public servant was respond to the hurricanes Milton and Helene disasters in the American South last September. Over 273 people died because they had less than 24 hours notice that floods were going to impact them within less than 20 hours. Google was working on data and now has the tools that they would have had almost a week's notice to evacuate, to reroute traffic, to tell people, get out of your homes. These are meaningful measures, and I know, thankfully, we have not had such severe weather events here, but friends, we cannot predict right now whether we won't, and so we need to be prepared. And artificial intelligence and tools that Google are developing and others are really important to those conversations. And it's also helping communities like Los Angeles and Hawaii, who've seen extreme fire events, now use ingestion of air quality data so they can not only remind residents when it's okay to re-enter their neighborhood due to higher air quality levels, but also help those communities plan better resilient communities in long-range plans. Now, operations is really significant as well. Over 40% of every public budget in transportation goes towards operations. That's not just building, right, the road, bridge, or bike lane, that's maintaining it. And these systems are maintained for 30, 50, 100 years. And so asset management is a big term in the transportation realm, and that just means that of all the things that we own and build and manage, we should know their quality and categorize them. And artificial intelligence now is working throughout the country in states like New York, Illinois, Georgia, Texas, to document every single part of the asset, the curb, the sign, so that when you're driving down the road or going through a bike lane, when you see the sign, you can actually read it, and it helps keep people safe. And of course, we couldn't do any of this without the foundational role of artificial intelligence in long-range planning. I'll share a little bit about that tool as I conclude. So last couple slides, I just want to tell a little bit about example. So in California, we have deployed this vulnerable road user database where we can work with Caltrans, one of the largest transportation agencies in the country, and we've been able to predict where near misses are, which is where a crash almost happens, and protect vulnerable road users so that people who are biking and walking are safe. In New York, we're using artificial intelligence to prevent what are called bridge strikes, one of the biggest large infrastructure issues in America where a vehicle might not know that it's over height. And with new artificial intelligence and video detection, we can detect that by 2 inches and immediately talk to the driver, alert the transportation authority so that they can divert that, keep people safe, keep freight flowing, because we know we love our Amazon deliveries, and also keep that infrastructure safe. We also debuted earlier this year with MTA, one of the largest transportation agencies in the country, a new tool where instead of sending inspectors out into the tunnels in Manhattan throughout the boroughs and trying to see whether the tracks were safe, we're using new Pixel phones and AI that can immediately look at the track and other pieces of infrastructure and say, hey, this is going to fail in the next month. You need to send someone out immediately, or make sure you maintain this next year. It's saving valuable resources and keeping people safe. And lastly, you might have seen some news about tools like Project Greenlight, which is where some cities have taken advantage of a tool where they're immediately rerouting traffic signals based on the data that they're getting from the vehicles and movements surrounding it, and immediately optimizing your traffic signals so you're not sitting there at a red light being like, there's no one at this intersection, why can't I go? And then it's already helping city traffic engineers find rerouting and better mapping tools for their community. Here in the middle, you see an example of the tool that I mentioned where we're working with Hawaii to help them build better resiliency plans and help their communities figure out where they should be building in the future and building infrastructure in the future to address their own long-term climate impacts. And Mobility AI is a brand new tool that we're debuting that allows all of the information I mentioned, all of those 400 applications into one tool so that you can ask a question like, where should the city of Bellevue be investing in their long-range transportation plan in 20 years? And with the snap of 2 fingers, you could get an answer. Now, I didn't want this to be an overview of Google. I'm just trying to show the art of the possible about what technology and innovation can do for community. It's something I'm very passionate about. And I'm also passionate about ingesting not just data, but the arts into the sciences and the work that we do. And so I'm actually someone who has an arts degree. Yes, Dad, I'm using it. And I love to read Mark Twain, someone who's very, very resonating right now in our time and place here in America and beyond. And Mark Twain has this beautiful quote that is, the 2 most important days of your life are the day that you were born and the day that you find out why. I truly believe I was here to meet all of you, become friends, help learn from you, and to help ensure we are using technology and innovation to solve some of the world's hardest challenges. And you, my friends in Bellevue, Seattle, and beyond, are the community that can really put the star on the map for innovation. So thank you for reminding me about my why, and I look forward to hearing about yours. Thank you.
So we're going to have a Q&A portion, but before we do that, again, thank you. I want to commemorate the moment by a selfie with all of you. So if you will humor us.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you. So, outstanding. A lot of inspiring ideas there. Yeah, we want to invite all of you. Please introduce yourself, and we'll get this to you. Raise your hand if you'd
Test.
like
Can you see
to-
if that one's working?
Test.
Oh, I think they both are. There we go.
Don't be bashful. Tell us your why.
Be brave, be bold.
All right, we're all friends here, so. John?
Hi, John Murphy with the City of Bellevue Transportation Department. Curious, what are the biggest risks you've seen in deploying AI without fully considering community impacts, and how can agencies avoid such risks?
Great question, and that's probably one of the most significant and common questions we ask, and there's 2 things I would think about. One is, whether in a company like Google or a public agency, a lot of organizations are defining their own AI principles, right? And it's kind of what I started with, like, what is the mission? Why are you using it? What are some of the safeguards? And so, for example, some of the principles that we embody are, we will only use artificial intelligence for public good. We will only use artificial intelligence that is deeply founded in the scientific method and in research. We believe in research and science. We also, for example, in part of our principles, talk about it will not be used if it promotes a bias. As we know, some of the early AI models were highly biased on skin color and different cultural identities. So that's just some examples. And then the second thing is a lot of communities in the public sector are developing governance bodies, right? So maybe a public agency might have someone from their IT department, maybe it's the transportation department, different types of stakeholders, and having kind of a committee that develops those principles, right? And then has some ideas on how they might want to be using artificial intelligence. And I always, when you go back to human-centered design, not to add a third, I think it's still very important to have those conversations with your community, right? So you're bringing them along with you. And then as you're developing those principles and governance bodies, you're making sure the right people are at the table, or at least including all those voices. The principles reflect the values of your community. Great question, yeah.
Hi, Kristen. This may be along the similar lines, but how do you start to whet the appetite of some of the decision makers in our public regarding the topic of AI? How do you lower the guard and make it not a scary thing, but something that's valuable for the community?
Yeah. Show, don't tell, right? I think about 15 years ago when I saw my first autonomous vehicle, so for the records, friends, I'm actually a Luddite. I don't always love technology. I used to have a dumb phone, not a smartphone, for a very significant period of time. And when autonomous vehicles were being developed in the DARPA initiative, which was the Department of Defense, first tested them, and then companies like Google's Moonshot factory started to develop the technology, I was very skeptical. But the first time I entered an autonomous vehicle, I realized, oh gosh, so there are safeguards. There are restrictions around this. And it also serves some new use cases, like my elderly father who can't get around and might be able to actually move around my small town community in South Dakota. So I think showing them is so important. So for example, some of the images, the screenshots in the last couple slides, those are images taken directly from demonstrations from when we're going into an organization saying, okay, don't just listen to me, let me show you. And then if you don't like it, great. But then it's on you to be able to make that decision. Yeah, that's great.
Hello, I'm Mark Madden. Welcome, Google, to transportation. One of the things that's been lacking throughout my career is data for traffic control. And even today, we have traffic counters, which are our main input, and they don't tell us what's happening on the weekends. They don't tell us what's happening on Christmas season or when school starts or holidays. Pedestrian data is almost non-existent. And yet, pedestrian data itself is very critical in signal timing. We have pedestrian clearance times that are generally set to a maximum because we don't know if the pedestrian started crossing earlier, how slow they are, how fast they are. They affect signal timing that can screw up a whole city. And I wonder if Google is very deep in data collection.
Yes, absolutely. And I really appreciate that question, Mark. And I might offer a little bit of a twist on it. Let's have a conversation. I think sometimes we're actually not data poor. I think we're insights poor. Data rich and insights poor. And what I mean by that is we actually have a lot of different disparate data sources, but we don't always combine them. And I'll share an example. When I was running our Transportation Management Center in Minnesota, we purchased 14 different types of data sets, whether it was connected vehicle data, it was traffic signal data, traffic signal optimization, we had an ATMS provider, lots of acronyms. The whole goal is to get to those insights. And so now, with the help of AI that can ingest, for example, Google Earth footage, it can take third-party vehicle data from the original equipment manufacturers, right, Ford, GM, and combine all of that data and actually come up with good insights. So you're absolutely right. And I remember a day at a time, I remember Franz when we were in the industry, and they would say things like, well, pedestrians should just have to wear a little, a beacon so that we could tell where they are in all times. That's not meaningful, right? That's not going to work. But with the advent of AI, we can use video and satellite imagery and information that's coming around the vehicle and even within the vehicle, there's a debate there, and ingest all that together to understand where people and vehicles are in the system so that we can prevent those crashes. But I do agree with you. We have a ways to go.
Great presentation, Kristen. Daniel from City of Bellevue. We met earlier. Appreciate meeting you. My question revolves around private-public partnerships. I think we've seen from your presentation, it's clear that private sector innovates fast. there is a role for the partnerships to exist. A lot of cities and government entities would probably struggle. How do we meaningfully partner with a company like Google, the size it is, right? And what are the problems that we can engage in together, and what are the initial steps that we can take to further a partnership? Can you give us any guidance on how that would, what your vision of that looks like?
Absolutely. And I think it starts off with, I mentioned the word transparency. That's a philosophical value of ours. It's being transparent about what your goals are and our goals are. There are some companies, and there are parts of Google that want to sell a product, right? Right now, with Google Public Sector, what we're trying to do is invest in the art of the possible. Is there a big problem statement that we can help solve together? Well, we shouldn't be the ones coming up with the problem statements. It should be you, right? So it should, the first step should be a willingness to come to the table and share, here's an actual problem that I'm just flummoxed with. Could you help solve it? And then it's up to the private company like Google to say, actually, yeah, we could do that. Or no, we can't. We'd actually have to bring in another partner. And even to get to that table, I think to your point is, and this is why I brought this slide back up again, I think there's a lot of ethical barriers in a lot of public agencies to even having those conversations because we want to uphold the public interest. We want to ensure fairness for all parties. So this is where you just have to know what your own local community/state regulations are. And this is where, from my personal perspective and Google's perspective, there's a lot of opportunity to make those more flexible so you can simply have those conversations. That's why I recommend things like the request for information or sometimes the request for innovation, because you can put out your problem statements. This is what we did in Minnesota. We would say, here's our top 10 problems. They're big problems. We can't fix them. But is there someone out there who could? And if so, what would you do? And maybe how much would it cost? And what other partners would we bring to the table? I think that's an opportunity for us to really dive deeper into a public-private partnership that's meaningful for both parties without one just trying to sell a product to another.
Hi, thank you. Robert Acevedo with HDR Engineering. I really I like your sentiment on changing the way we speak. As data scientists, ICS engineers, I think we need to come up with better language other than ingesting data, but that's my 2 cents. To follow along with how agencies can use this meaningfully, do you have any examples of where agencies are starting to look at bringing this into their policy or into some of their guiding documents, and where some of this language around AI makes sense, either in comp plans or vision statements or those kinds of things?
Absolutely. I'll give 2 examples, but just to clarify, you said you're from HDR? So kudos, friends, to our colleagues at HDR. They actually have a really wonderful community engagement team, and I really applaud the work that your firm is doing in this space to really go out into community. Katie Caskey is one of their national leads and an award-winning strategist in this space, so just kudos. You have some great local expertise here. Great. Not to belabor the question, there's 2 examples I would come up with. One is from a state level. The state of Texas, again, while being the biggest department of transportation nationally, they have 25 different districts because the state is so large. They knew that because of that, they needed to come up with strategy. And so just last fall announced their artificial intelligence strategy. It's a public document. You can go onto their website and look at it. It's actually, to your question, kind of gives this governance statement, right? They brought different people together. It kind of defines their principles. And then to our earlier question, it actually defined what are the problem statements that AI might be able to help with. And that's a really good example. I would also plug your own community here. I mean, in your long-range plans, you've who helped remind me that this community here has your own definition of artificial intelligence and how it can be incorporated into your transportation long-range planning. That's a huge visionary step. And so I would encourage you to applaud yourselves as you're looking to the future. Hi.
Thank you, Kristen, for outstanding presentation. I'm Mohamed Uddin. I'm the County Traffic Engineer, Snohomish County. So as a public agencies, our biggest challenge is the technology we pick during that time became like a barrier at the future when we see the need is different. So my question is, I think Google for transportation, and I am sure that other companies like Microsoft or Amazon or some others also be thinking that way. How do you, as a public agency, how can we make sure that the technology or the tools we are choosing for the future can be compatible with anything new coming in? And
Yeah. Oh, Mohammed, that is the evergreen question. I have two ideas, but before that, I want to ask a question. Who has the same phone that they've had for the last 15 years? If there's someone in this room, I actually want to meet you because I would applaud you. That's the same philosophy we're asking our public agencies to use, is that a technology that was invented 15 years ago is still going to be accurate and real time and up to speed and still supported by the company, right? And that's just not the way it's supported, right? Technology evolves, they argue, every 6 months to get faster and faster and better. And so there's two things that we've been talking about both at a national level and internal to Google. One is definitely use scenario planning, right? There are going to be lots of different people coming up to, daises like this and telling you different things. You get to decide what the future looks like. And I love the adage, I've shared this in other avenues, that we're really good at predicting what the future will look like, but we're actually really terrible as humans at predicting how long that will take. For example, at the World's Fair in 1939, they thought they would have autonomous vehicles completely throughout the country with no human drivers by 1960. Right. So we're really bad at predicting when that will happen. So the Federal Highway Administration, the Department of Transportation, other states, and AMPO is a great supporter. They give recommendations on different scenarios you should think about, right? So that you're investing maybe in the first couple scenarios, but you're prepared for scenario 3, maybe where self-driving cars really are advented everywhere. And so that's a really great principle. And I think the second opportunity is just really to be nimble in your planning for operations and maintenance. So one of the biggest challenges we worked with, for example, at the Federal Highway Administration, is Congress sets the requirements for surface transportation, at least. And one of the challenges we have is you cannot use federal dollars for operations and maintenance of these technologies. So for example, if you installed a great new traffic signal that was brand new, if you had to replace it within a few years, you would have to pay the government back. And so we've been working very closely, and I applaud my colleagues at AASHTO, which is the National Trade Association that represents state departments of transportation. That is one of their recommendations in the new congressional authorization. So every 5 years, Congress has to reauthorize funding for transportation. That is coming up next year. And so that will be, hopefully, and it looks like it will be part of the package. But if you're not beholden to those federal dollars, I would highly encourage a public agency to allocate some of that money aside. And if you can't do that, start tracking those dollars and needs, those metrics, so that you can come back to the city council and say, if we had this budget, this is what our data is telling us we would need so that we can actually maintain these technologies in a better way. Because I don't know if anyone is of the age who remembers the call boxes along the interstates. At one time, we thought that would be the future, and clearly that's not. So let's be more foresightful.
Say it's Fabian. I have a couple of questions. Question number one. AI information that user use is based on some kind of database. How often, let's say, Google update that? So the information, let's say that I'm interested in getting into some information from the AI. How often Google updates that data? Is the data from 2 years or 2 days or 2 hours ago? What kind of process you go through to update a database?
Great question. And the lawyer in me, the recovering lawyer, wants to say it depends. So it's really about the information you're trying to use, right? So for example, in the state of Illinois, we're working with them to use traffic information that they get from a third party that every couple weeks goes and uses LiDAR to scan the entire roadside to look at the state of signs. We, to not use your word ingest, we put that into a database. And then that immediately spits out to their engineering and maintenance teams, hey, you need to go fix this sign right away. People don't know the speed limit. Or this is a stop sign that you can't even see as a stop sign. You have to fix that immediately. So that, for example, is only as good as the third-party data that we're getting. For Google Maps, for example, we ingest Waze information, which for those of you who do use Waze is real-time crowdsourced information, right? So that can be as real as, a couple milliseconds. So it's really only as good as the use case we're trying to work on. But to your point, it's very important to know what information you're putting into these systems, because artificial intelligence is only as good as the information you're putting in. That'll be good information coming out.
The second question is about air transportation, and as you know, these days, the air transportation is a subject that a lot of fears and discussions. What can you share with us? What kind of a progress Google has made as far as making it basically air transportation safer and all that? What kind of AI technology you're looking at?
Well, that, my friend, is a very personal passion project of mine. I have family that have served in the Air Force and been pilots themselves. So this is very important to at least my family in South Dakota, but many families nationally. And as someone who lived in D.C. when the most recent crash between the helicopter and the plane at DCA took place, it was another stark reminder that the safety of our air system is first and foremost, right? The U.S. is first in the world in our safety measures, and that's due to a very particular program called NOTAMs, which just means notice to airmen. It's a little outdated, air people. But essentially, it's like traffic control in the sky, right? Just how we sometimes have traffic management centers that can see where all the vehicles are on our roads. We have to do that with the 5,000 flights that are happening each day and make sure those flight paths don't intersect. And NOTAMs is a really important database. And as some of you've probably read on the news, NOTAMs is kind of like the call boxes. It's about 20 years old. And so we partnered with a company this year and just in the last month announced that we are now working with the Federal Aviation Administration, the U.S. Department of Transportation, to update NOTAMs. So it's using state-of-the-art software and AI so that those situations never happen again. Thank you for that question.
And the last question, you mentioned earlier on that you're working with the government agencies. What kind of concern, kind of fear you hear from the employees of that agency? Hey, AI is going to take over. I'm going to lose a job. What kind of information that you share with them or kind of tell them to feel comfortable that that's not going to be the case?
Great question. And I think we have fears of everything, right? And I look to this slide here because of this idea about curiosity. Often we are fearful because we don't have information. And we're not always great in transportation about communicating, right? We have to proactively ensure we're getting information out to our employees, to our stakeholders, to our community, and we always have an opportunity to improve that. And so I do get that question a lot. Is AI going to replace my job? And the idea is it will just replace what your job looks like in the future. Again, we don't know when because it's really hard for us to predict when, but there are tools out there. One of them that we work with the U.S. Department of Transportation and other federal agencies is using artificial intelligence to do things like read your emails for you and schedule events in your inbox and help you manage your task list because those are very burdensome administrative tasks. I don't know if there's anyone in the room like me who after a day of 9 to 5 meetings are like, oh my gosh, now I have to do the work, right? That's hard. So helping to automate some of those tasks so we can actually use our minds to be creative and be curious and use our technical expertise, that's what we should be doing. That's what the human mind is brilliantly trained for. And so that's where we think some of those opportunities lie. Yeah.
Hello. Thank you for the presentation today. My name is Jay Backman, City of Seattle Vision Zero. And my question overlaps public partnerships or public sector and private sector partnerships as well as data. And I have a little bit of a chicken and egg question. And that is that I think our industry is changing in how different municipalities have goals and what we're planning to look forward to in terms of what we want our transportation system to look like. I see that you had quite a few examples today of how different applications can help government agencies and workers to do some of that internalized work for planning. But how can Google partner with us to digest what city or county or statewide plans can be for things like mode shift and encouraging the user? I mean, really, you are interacting with users far more on a day-to-day basis, I think, than directly with the government agencies ourselves. So how is Google planning on coordinating with those municipalities to help us in shifting and moving towards what we want those transportation networks to look like in the future?
I love that question, Jay, because it's really centered in the vision and what policies are needed to achieve that vision, right? And I think before I answer that question, I think it's really important for us to know that we work in a siloed sector. Transportation is actually one of the most decentralized sectors in any sector. And what I mean by that is we have a federal agency, the U.S. Department of Transportation, and arguably a few others, NTSB and Energy maybe. And then we have 52 state departments of transportation. We have 10,000 cities of the first class. We have hundreds of counties, and each of them has a role of governance in transportation, right? And they should, because we are a decentralized society. We believe in federalism. But that also makes the coordination very hard. So my only offer is two thoughts. One is we like to convene, and what a great testament today, right? Bringing different voices and people together. One of the things we tried to do at the Houston Department of Transportation as I was leaving is try to convene AASHTO, which is the Association for State DOTs, with AMPO, the Metropolitan Planning Organization Trade Association, with NACTO, look at all these acronyms, the City Transportation Official Organization, with other organizations like, for example, APTA, which is the Public Transit Association. But until you get all of those voices at the same table, it is going to be continuing to be different visions. But until then, or as we continue that goal, tools like this mobility AI are exactly what you're talking about. It's kind of like, what could a vision of a long-range plan look like in the future? And you can enter that data into these tools, and it could say, okay, well, if you wanted to have a long-range plan where it's just bike-friendly, no cars around the roads, not giving any recommendations, just a question, it could actually envision that for you and give you some ideas on what that policy or plan needed to look like. And that's, again, coming back to we have to vision the art of the possible. Great question, Jay. I'd love to see how that evolves in the future.
My name's John Larson Friend. I'm a transportation planner consultant with Pertite here in Washington. I also have an arts degree in film, so storytelling near and dear to my heart. And I'm married to a lawyer who works in the AI space.
Oh my gosh,
so,
you're my favorite now. Okay,
yeah,
great.
we should talk. So I understood to, laugh at your "it depends" joke too. So AI is useless without data. There are a lot of companies out there that gather and package and then charge cities specifically to, manage that said data. Cities gather their own data and may or may not share it. So Seattle, very good at sharing a lot of data. What do you think the future of democratization of transportation data looks like?
Okay, great question, and I love this question, and it might even be the one we have to end on, and it's a good one. So we believe, as you talked about in our philosophies, we believe in transparency. Everyone should have equal access to information, right, in one click or the snap of two fingers. And so there was a conversation over the last few years, and Franz mentioned this at the beginning, this term digital infrastructure was kind of coined a few years ago just to imply that just as we're building physical infrastructure like bike lanes and bus lanes and roads and bridges, we should also be building out the infrastructure of the future. And maybe that's, what we call edge computing or cloud services to store all this information. I'm putting it up here as though there's an actual cloud above us, but you get it. And so one of the conversations was, not everyone has the ability to pay for that information. And can you imagine if we continued this model, just follow or go along with me for a little bit, it's the same as though if we'd have to pay for 911. In the 1980s, the FCC realized AT&T had developed this extraordinary product where with just 3 digits, you could hail an emergency responder. Imagine if we asked people to pay for that or had different pricing levels for that. So there's a national conversation at the federal government and in companies like ours and in other agencies to have what's called federated data. Is there a role where maybe the federal government pays for a certain base level of data and communities can access that? And if you wanted something cooler and newer, maybe you'd be able to pay a little bit more, but no one should have to pay for safety. Saving lives is not a privilege, it is a moral obligation. And so I hope we continue conversations like that, Sarah, and tell your wife if she's a smart lawyer, maybe she can help us out.
Kristen, if we could, just one more.
Oh, yes.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you for taking one last question. My name is Bahar. I'm a data analyst with Transport Group. And I've heard you talk about the public-private sector partnership and also aviation. I was just curious to see if there's any interest from Google to partner on freight data and freight planning and freight parking. These are a couple of efforts that's been going on along Washington and other states that I'm involved in. So I was curious to get your thoughts on that.
And Washington is part of the Northwest Passage, as we know, which Minnesota and Washington as states were very good colleagues in trying to understand how to at least move freight from the Midwest to the Pacific Northwest. That's how I got my first taste of freight innovation. Yes, absolutely. So under this bucket you see here of operations, freight is one of the largest contributors to the economy, right? It contributes 4% to our national economy. And so we're looking at organizations in the Midwest and in the Pacific Northwest that are doing things like truck parking. That's been a big picture, right? People don't even know where to park in their own personal vehicles. Imagine if you're a freight vehicle operator and your hours of service, you're at, right about the end of your hours of service max, and you have to find parking. It's really hard. So we're using tools to develop maps to map out those kinds of things. And we're also looking at figuring out how maybe there's an opportunity to build a national freight map so that different companies can understand where freight is being moved. That was a concept originated about 6 years ago under the White House, under a freight logistics opportunity project called Flow. And so absolutely, that's a key part of our portfolio. Yeah. Continue the work in Washington.
All right. Thank you so much, Kristen. I know there's lots of other questions, but we do want to be mindful of the time. I also want to mention there's still ample food out there, so please do help yourself. And with that, let's just give a round of applause. Thank you so much.